We're talking about Ethiopian coffees. Ken, I just think you should just take a. You know as much as anyone I know about Ethiopian coffee.
I love Ethiopia coffees, and we taste a lot of them at Coffee Review. But to tell you the truth, when I see a lineup of coffees and I don't know the roaster, I'll usually gravitate to an Ethiopia or a Kenya. The Ethiopia has many things going for it in terms of coffee, so many that I don't want to enumerate them all. Number one, of course, it's the original botanical home of Coffea arabica, the species of coffee that produces all of the really great coffees of the world. And through isolation and good government policy later on in history, the Ethiopians have kept all of that genetic diversity of the Arabica plant intact in their country. I mean, some of these varieties, these are the great varieties of coffee that have the most complexity and vivacity in general in the world, and some have escaped to other places like Gesha, which is the famous coffee variety that's grown all over Central America now. But in general, the Ethiopians have all those coffees for themselves, and there's a very varied kind of representation of them. One village may grow a somewhat different assortment of coffee varieties than another village, for example. Ethiopia has the most varied and richest variety of coffee varieties. That's one of its great starting points. And the other is the Ethiopian people have grown up with coffee. They're not like Kenyans, for example, who produce a really terrific coffee, but they drink tea when they go home. Ethiopians drink coffee. They consume about 40% of their entire production themselves. There's a kind of a coffee knowledge saturated down to the people in the villages. And the leadership, however confused and contentious the leadership, political leadership in Ethiopia has been over the years, the coffee establishment, the scientists and the botanists and the coffee tasters are so sophisticated and so knowledgeable about their own coffees. For somebody who's buying Ethiopia coffee, the main issue is not region. Most Ethiopia coffees come from south central Ethiopia, and there are old market names like Yirgacheffe, which a lot of viewers may have heard or be familiar with. Sidamo is another one. Sometimes it's pronounced Sidama. Guji is an up-and-coming regional name. But in some ways, these are not as important as how the coffee is processed. In other words, what is the sequence of events between when the coffee is picked and when it's finally shipped out as a hard, stable green bean. And those steps we call processing, not a very exciting word, but the acts are exciting. There are two main processing methods used in Ethiopia today. One method is the oldest method, which we call natural. All coffees are natural, actually, but this particular process is called natural. And the coffee fruit is simply set out to dry and dried so that the skin and the fruit pulp tightens and dries around the bean. And then it's later removed by machine, kind of scrubbed or knocked off. What this does to the bean is impart certain kind of fruit and sugars to the bean, so that natural processed coffees tend to be kind of bittersweet, but probably more sweet than bitter, kind of lower tone, heavier in body, and the characteristic Floral notes that are typical of the Ethiopian plant material are lower toned. So you have dark chocolate, blueberry, cherry notes. The floral notes tend to be maybe more like lily or rose. The other type that consumers will find in stores are the wash types, wet processed. What this means is that all of the material around the coffee seed or bean is removed right after picking. Usually within a day after picking, it's scrubbed or washed off through various sequence of acts. And that process is called the washed or wet process because it usually uses water in the last stages to clean the beans. So these clean, sparkling beans are then dried. They're not dried in the fruit. They're dried with the fruit removed, and this is very important because what happens typically, fruit notes that in a natural dry processed coffee might be blueberry or cherry tend to be more citrusy, more acidy in a good way, lemon, peach often. The berry, light kind of a tart berry. There are chocolate notes, but they tend to be more like cocoa, not a heavy dark chocolate. And finally, the floral notes tend to be very liberated by this process, and they tend to be high-toned, like star jasmine, and if you're used to that kind of white night-blooming flower. I think you and I, Kevin, talked about lilac, which is a good one from where you live in Chicago. People, based on what they are smelling in their garden, could find other notes. But it's a kind of a lighter, sweeter rather than the heavier, sweeter floral notes you find in the natural coffees. How did that sound, Kevin? You have any clarifications?
Thank you for going first because it helped me process some things, and it reminded me that when my introduction to what I would call specialty coffees, I remember seeing fortified with Sidamo on a mocha java, and I'm sure it was a blend of obviously a bunch of coffees, and it was a very affordable way of getting into, and I still think it is. If you took up the practice of just wanting to taste Ethiopian coffees, you would find you could afford it because they're even the most expensive. Unlike some areas of the world, it seems like, and it's a very small business centered, isn't it? Isn't it? Maybe that's true of most of the coffee world in reality, but I think of Ethiopia as being a bunch of, in effect, small cottage industries. I think of that, and I kind of have a romance about it.
I think it's a justified romance. The industry is organized around coffee mills that they call washing stations. And that's where they may be operated by cooperatives, or they may be operated by exporters, or they may be operated by entrepreneurs increasingly who are creating almost a coffee brand. And there, the producers who live in villages bring their coffees. They might be members of the cooperative, in which case there's certain arrangements that guarantee them certain prices for their coffees if it fulfills certain quality standards. It's usually, I think, a good relationship with the management of the washing stations in other cases when they're private. But at any rate, the producers themselves, at least when I visited, they live in small villages. They produce almost everything they consume there in the village. They build their houses from local material. I mean, it's aside from the fact that you know that there's no good medical care, and there may be other issues having to do with accessibility to water, perhaps, although there's a lot of water in that part of Ethiopia. I should say that people have the vision of Ethiopia as being arid, and pictures of some starvation period from years ago may stick in their heads, but in fact, where the coffee's grown is lush. It's beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful coffee landscapes in the world. And I've been in villages where there's no metal things except the wheelbarrow wheels. There are coffee trees usually growing around in the village itself, and then everywhere. They grow coffee everywhere in Ethiopia. And if they don't sell it to the washing station, they just dry it themselves and drink it. Yeah, that's the romance. Anyhow, I got carried away. And but
that's what romance is for.
Right. Kevin, it occurred to me as you were talking that there's an alternative processing method that comes up now in Ethiopia. It's coming up all over the world, and it has this rather daunting name called anaerobic.
Yeah.
And anaerobic processing is basically involves a fermenting step without in sealed tanks. And so what that does is when you seal out the oxygen, and sometimes they fill the tanks with carbon dioxide, what you're doing is you're creating a different kind of ferment that doesn't have yeast, doesn't create alcohol, and it's done by bacteria the way it's done in our bodies, basically. And so you get a fermenty taste that is best. We usually at Coffee Review associate it often with yogurt, unflavored yogurt, or kefir if you're familiar with that yogurt, liquid form of yogurt, or maybe kombucha. It's also like sauerkraut and kimchi,
right.
but those are bad associations for coffee. At any rate, that it makes a different kind of flavor, and what it tends to do is just exaggerate floral notes, wildly exaggerate floral notes and fruit notes. And also you sometimes get this kind of yogurty, musky kind of edge. Pioneered in Panama and now is very widely practiced in Colombia and other places in Central America. But the Ethiopians are really aware, the establishment and all these exporters and cooperative leaders are very aware of what's happening in the coffee world. So now you have anaerobic processed Ethiopias, which are sort of flowers on flowers. You have a floral accentuating processing method on top of a floral coffee. So if we have one of these, it will probably we'll probably know it when we taste it. A third,
Yes,
so
yeah.
Natural, washed or wet, anaerobic.
And I had a Colombian anaerobic this morning at breakfast, and it was
What did you think?
quite delicious. So I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, although it is definitely a unique taste, and I would have to say I could imagine someone not enjoying it. I think it's something that I would buy carefully, choose carefully first, and then see what you think about it if you haven't had one.
Well, we're ready to taste coffees
Yeah.
and
Yes.
watch me make a fool of myself by picking the wrong processing method. This is where I'm going to focus. I'm going to focus on the processing method plus all other good things you and I will find in the cup.
To me, this is not a tune detective show as much as just exploring the tastes we get and trying to figure out where they
I
come
have
from.
imagined myself as this heroic detective myself. So.
Sherlock Holmes of coffee.
No, not.
You
better
should get
than
that on your business
This
cards.
is James Bond of coffee. I guess he wasn't a
Oh, the
detective.
James
Yeah.